From choosing to recruit a specific member as a way of avoiding throwing down with them again, to scheduling surgery just before a career-halting squash. I'm Gareth, this is What Culture Wrestling, and here are 8 genius ways wrestlers got out of terrible matches. Number 8, Brian Pillman has surgery to get out of Hulk Hogan squashing him. As 1995 rolled into 1996, Brian Pillman was quickly growing into one of the hottest and most intriguing acts in all of wrestling. His loose cannon gimmick was incredibly captivating, with fans unsure about what in the hell the unstable performer would do next, as he blurred the lines between kayfabe and reality. And with the WCW star's rise being pretty hard to ignore, it inevitably caught the attention of a certain blonde-haired icon known for dropping the leg, brother. Coming into WCW Uncensored 1996, the original plan was seemingly to have 9 heels face off against Hulk Hogan and Randy Savage in a doomsday cage match. Instead of the eventual 8 the Megapowers actually fought. Pillman would have been one of these villains that the Hulkster ultimately conquered on the night. A move that likely wouldn't have done that edgy new gimmick much good at the time. So as Dave Meltzer would later recall on Wrestling Observer Radio, Pillman realized he needed to find a way to get out of the potentially career-halting match, and decided that now would be a perfect time to get the surgery he was required to have every few years to remove polyps in his throat. He could have had it at any point, but smartly chose this precise moment for obvious reasons. Pillman didn't tell his employers he was going under the knife, and WCW weren't exactly happy about the fact he now couldn't compete so soon after the procedure. But that quick thinking meant that the icon brilliantly managed to dodge a contest he sensed was going to be an all-time stinker beforehand. And he was right in the end, with it picking up that year's Wrestling Observer Newsletter Award for Worst Match of the Year. Number 7, Dan Severn threatens to shoot on opponents if WWE make him lose matches. This won't be the last time the Undertaker's Ministry of Darkness is mentioned in this list, folks. Oh, you got a fun ride ahead. But whereas the other entry will involve a star being welcomed into their demonic ranks, this one will be focusing on a bloke who took one look at that spooky faction and give it a big ol' nope. Said person was UFC Hall of Famer Dan Severn, with the MMA legend rejecting the idea of joining Taker's gang in 1999 after not liking the thought of having 666, the mark of the beast, drawn onto his forehead. Rather than see where their talent was coming from and just accepting this response though, Severn would later recall on the Jordan Garber Now podcast how agents responded by telling him that if he didn't do what they asked, they could just have him start losing matches. Oh boy. That particular threat very nearly led to disaster too, as Severn let those WWE personnel know that it didn't actually say he had to lose to anyone in his contract. What was stopping him stepping in between the ropes and shooting on anyone who attempted to make him look bad or defeat him? Not much. Or as Severn put it, what if I walk into your world of fantasy and turn it to reality? Yep, that's pretty intimidating. That ominous warning alone was seemingly enough to make WWE wisely think twice about both that dodgy ministry character and booking some 7 potential car crash losses. And it wasn't long before the two parties went their separate ways anyway. Number 6, Terry Funk leaves a note. This has to be one of the greatest ways anyone has ever swerved some dodgy booking. There were plans there at one point for Terry Funk to work as one of Shawn Michaels' knights at the 1993 Survivor Series, with the Heartbreak Kid being swapped in for Jerry Lawler in the scheduled 4-on-4 match against the Hart family. Lawler had been indicted on charges of statutory rape and sodomy before the event, though the charges would eventually be dropped. But that match would have eventually seen the wrestling icon being beaten by the Hart team and eventually unmasked in the middle of the ring. Well, that was the plan anyway. Not feeling that being squashed in such a way on WWE television was the best idea, and after also deciding that he actually didn't fancy the head booker role he'd apparently been offered at the time, the Funker decided to duck out of the contest with a note. Not just any note though. Said message explained to Vince McMahon that he couldn't do the job for the Hitman and Co. or follow through with their deal because his horse was sick. That was his story and he was sticking to it. Before long, he'd hopped on a plane and was heading far away from this royal mess, with his role of the sharpshootered Red Knight ultimately going to Barry Horowitz instead. And another iconic Funker story was born. And while we're talking about Terry Funk, I want to know right now in the comments section, what is your favorite ever Terry Funk moment? Now back to the video. Number 5, Cody Rhodes makes the people want him and avoids another Seth Rollins match. The anxiety was real in the days leading up to, during, and shortly after February 2nd, 2024's edition of SmackDown. Coming into that Blue show, Cody Rhodes had incredibly managed to win back-to-back Royal Rumbles. But rumblings of an incoming Great One threatening to ruin his story still had folks worried about his chances of dethroning Roman Reigns at Mania 40. Things got more uncomfortable for Nightmare lovers when WWE teased a potential pivot into yet another Cody Rhodes versus Seth Rollins showdown on the grandest stage on January 30th's Raw. Now that match wouldn't have been horrendous stupendous by any means. It'd no doubt be as brilliantly worked as each of their prior 3 high-profile wars, but it was definitely seen by many as a frustrating alternative to the more desired Rhodes vs. Reigns 2 war. But then, in an inspired move, intentional or not, that helped spark a movement which forced WWE into changing their plans for Rocky to challenge for his cousin's title, the always real Rhodes reacted to the reality of The Rock taking his place in that main event spot on that aforementioned SmackDown like someone shot his dog in the face in the parking lot, as Brian Goetz would put it on the Masked Man show. And just like that, any hopes some within WWE had of getting the people to want Rock vs. Reigns over that WrestleMania 39 rematch were dashed. How could you not rally behind that face? Fans wanted Cody and Reigns going one-on-one, and that's what they ultimately got instead of the teased Rollins vs. Rhodes battle over the World Heavyweight Championship. Thanks for checking out this list today, folks, and if you're enjoying what you're watching, then hit that subscribe button down below for more What Culture Wrestling videos in your life. Number 4, Ken Shamrock gets out of his China match because of his kids. Joining his fellow former UFC fighter Dan Severn on this list, Ken Shamrock also wasn't a fan of an idea WWE had for him during the late 90s, is one way of putting it. Rather than being threatened with squash matches for not wearing the mark of the beast though, the world's most dangerous man was asked to throw down with the 9th wonder of the world. That China match immediately sounded like a terrible idea to Shamrock, with the UFC Hall of Famer eventually revealing on the 10 Count podcast that he didn't think hitting a woman in the ring would set the right example for his kids. Got a good point. Far from being a cunning tactic or anything, this was simply Shamrock smartly feeling that locking up with the opposite sex just wasn't the best look. And while he would ultimately still end up getting somewhat physical with China on an episode of Raw in May 1999, being pushed to the limit and suplexing her before instantly regretting his actions, he at least managed to convince WWE to not make him compete in an entire match against the legend by making them think of the children. Number 3, Roman Reigns smartly goes home to protect his family and also avoids a Goldberg match. Again, this one isn't necessarily a case of a wrestler just finding an inspired way to wiggle out of a contest they felt was a bad idea. Instead, it's a star smartly using a situation to set a good example. Back just before the world was initially brought to a screeching halt due to the pandemic in early 2020, Roman Reigns was set to throw down with Goldberg at WrestleMania 36. Most likely a finisher spamming match that wouldn't have set the world on fire if their eventual Elimination Chamber 2022 battle was anything to go by. However, once the reality of this unprecedented situation began to really hit, and the globe began to lock down, Reigns soon decided to back out of Mania 36, with Braun Strowman taking his place as the person to inevitably beat the man inside of the Performance Center. Now, Reigns' reasons for not being present at that show of shows had nothing, or at the very most, probably very little, to do with that no doubt dull Battle of the Spears. The big dog wanted to protect his family, and wasn't afraid to turn down the biggest spot the company had to offer to keep them safe. And it was that message that likely told the rest of the locker room that they shouldn't be afraid to do something similar, should they feel uncomfortable working during those scariest of times. That's some real locker room leader shizzle right there. By the time he'd returned to the company as the tribal chief, his call to put his family first instead of a quiet match against the WCW legend felt like one of the smartest and most important of recent times. Number 2, Triple H thinks a KO is good enough to conclude his Big Show rivalry. Over the years, the pair of wrestling legends known as Triple H and Big Show have collided in between the ropes on countless occasions, but very few of those probably spring to mind when thinking of either performer's greatest ever showings in a wrestling ring. That's because they were typically not all that great, with their singles match at New Year's Revolution 2006 being a particularly terrible outing for the WWE icons. And perhaps it was the memories of that particularly dull fight that influenced the game's decision to talk his way out of a teased grudge match with the Giant in 2013. For a while, it seemed WWE were building towards some sort of blow-off between the two as Show butted heads with the Authority stable. But rather than eventually locking up again in between the ropes, Strips told Paul White that he'd get to knock out the King of Kings, and that's the end of it.
You get to knock out the cerebral assassin, that's as good as breaking the streak, pal.
And while speaking on Talk is Jericho about Trips dodging that potential match, Show admitted to being very much frustrated by the call, feeling that contest would have done a lot for his career at the time, and though that may have been true, it's also likely it wouldn't have been the most thrilling of showdowns. Watching Show spark out the future head of WWE Creative got a nice pop in the end, and fans were likely saved from another 16-minute snooze fest. Number 1, Undertaker brought Mabel into the ministry to avoid matches with him. As promised, we return to the dead man's villainous squad for this final entry. A few years before The Undertaker created his Ministry of Darkness stable, the legend found himself sharing the squared circle with a quite clumsy Mabel a few times in 1995. And you have to imagine it wasn't an experience he enjoyed all that much, with none of those rather painful battles being fun ones for audiences either. So when Mabel eventually made his full-time return to the company in 1999 after a few years away, WWE, Mark Calloway seemingly had a plan. As he jokingly explained on a recent Q&A special for his 6 Feet Under show, Taker actually decided to bring Mabel into the ministry as a way of getting out of having to wrestle him anymore. Now sure, he did say this is a joke, but there was probably a little bit of truth in there at least, right? I mean, this was the same person who broke Taker's orbital bone at one point. Sure, this could just be the Phenom having a laugh and nothing else. And not having to lock up with the one-time king was simply an unintended bonus that came with having him in his team. Either way, he still managed to keep from having to wrestle Mabel for a while there, but would ultimately end up locking up with Viscera and Big Daddy V later down the road. So it was fun while it lasted. Has this video been fun for you? Well, if it has, then tap on this other one right here, because trust me, you will enjoy it just as much. Bye bye!